Welcome back to Philosophy 1101, Problems of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. Today will be our second lecture, our second discussion of the topic of personal identity. We'll be talking a little bit more about diachronic identity and then shifting to issues of synchronic identity after that. So you'll recall that last week we talked about theories of diachronic identity, where diachronic means something persisting over time. And we were trying to answer the question, what is it for a person stage P sub n plus 1 to be one and the same person as person stage P sub n, where n plus 1 is a later person stage. So what does it mean to say that my current self, the one sitting here in front of the camera right now, is the same person as the one that was in front of this camera a week ago, or that was standing on a street corner somewhere in Chicago a year ago, or that was sitting on an airplane 10 years ago? What are those? How do we answer the question, what is it for me to be the same person over time? Remember that the Locke-inspired psychological theory of continuity offered the following answer. It's a matter of being able to remember experiences had by an earlier person stage, a matter of the later person stages being able to remember experiences had by the earlier person stage. And in order to account for problems such as the brave officer paradox, we said, and there doesn't have to be a direct memory link between a later stage and an earlier stage. There can be indirect memory links. It can be that the old general remembers back to experiences had by the brave officer, who himself remembers back to experiences had by the young boy. So now that seems to solve that set of problems. We did, however, raise some questions about cases of an extreme sort concerning total amnesia, of the sort that you find with anterior-grade amnesia, where the patient, even if they've got some long-term memories, is not able to form any new memories after a certain accident, for example, that causes a lesion in the brain. In the case of Lenny from the movie Memento, we wondered whether it's possible for him to be the same person as the pre-accident self, if only because the two later stages are both able to link back to the pre-accident stage. And then by transitivity, it seems like each one is identical with the earlier stage. By transitivity, it seems like each one of the later stages is identical with one another, and yet they seem to have no awareness of one another at all. That raises a puzzle. But we might wonder, well, maybe that's a puzzle, but not necessarily an overwhelming problem. But if a later person stage could remember experiences had by an earlier person stage, then another simultaneous later person stage perhaps could do so as well. So suppose somebody has a brain bisection in which their two hemispheres are separated, the corpus callosum is severed, the set of nerves that connect the left and the right hemisphere, and that corpus callosum is severed, the two hemispheres no longer communicate with each other, and suppose that the two hemispheres are put inside of different bodies and go along living lives that are relatively normal. It's possible to live in a relatively normal way if you only have one hemisphere. As I understand it, there are things that you lose, but you're still able to operate, still able to function. And if that happens, these two new selves, so to speak, will go through time. Each of them will construct and achieve and produce new experiences. Each of them will be able to remember back to experiences had by the pre-bisection self. So couldn't there be, won't it follow that there are two individuals, both of whom are the same as the person that was there before the bisection? But if those two individuals are the same as the person that was there before the bisection, then aren't they one and the same person after all? What would it be to say that you've got one person inhabiting two distinct bodies at the same time? That seems very strange, very puzzling, very mind-bending. So in particular, it would seem that, for example, I would, if one of them counts as me, the other one counts as me, if that were to happen to me, I would shake hands with myself. I could kill myself. I could play tennis with myself without having to bounce the ball up against a wall, but actually play it across a net. That seems very odd. Something seems to be going a bit awry in our theory of personal identity if we want to depend upon psychological continuity. So here's an image. Person stage P sub n and person stage Q sub n are the results of the brain bisection, each of whom has memories that can be traced back to person stage P1. But now, by transitivity of identity, you'll recall, each of them is identical to P1 So Qn is identical to P1, and Pn is identical to P1. It seems to follow that Qn is one and the same person as Pn. That seems very strange. Suppose they were to see each other in the street, meet each other, get in a fight, for example, and this would be a case of one person getting in a fight with himself. Very strange. Likewise, if you're John Locke, you'd be certainly convinced that it's possible to survive the total destruction of your body so long as there is some causal chain that enables you to have memory links back to the earlier self. So there couldn't there be two Locks in heaven, each of whom are characters that behave like John Locke and seem to recall experiences had by the terrestrial pre-death John Locke. Each of them would seem to count as having a very good case for being John Locke. Could they both be? And in fact, you could have not just two, you could have four. You could have continued fission. In each of those could fissions that you have 8, and so on and so forth. John Locke's, or at least characters, persons, each of whom claims to be the person who is John Locke. We seem to have no basis for saying one is more John Locke than the other. And in fact, according to Locke's own definition, it would seem to follow that they all are. And in fact, there's only one person there, but that one person inhabits multiple bodies. But again, this seems very strange. Is it an absolute reductio ad absurdum of the view? Perhaps not, but it's a very bizarre consequence. Notice further that multiple personality disorder, such as when you've got multiple personae that seem to inhabit a single body at different times. A mythological, fictional case would be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but in current psychiatry, there are established cases of multiple personalities. In multiple personality, we seem to have cases in which more than one person might inhabit a single body. That seems possible, intelligible, but it seems less clear that it makes sense to have one person inhabiting multiple bodies at the same time. Again, it seems very bizarre to think that a person could shake hands with herself or kill herself, etc. This suggests that something perhaps has gone amiss with the psychological continuity theory of personal identity. And now let's think about another thought experiment that might put even more pressure on it. That is, here is a potentially more challenging issue for the proponent of the psychological continuity theory to address. Imagine that you are confronted with let's call it the body duplicator. What it's going to do is make a perfect, so to speak, 3D carbon copy of your body. You will get inside the machine, slide right in, you'll hear a whirring sound, and then it will make a perfect 3D carbon copy of your whole body, cell for cell duplicate. Now, that individual who, and suppose that new body functions perfectly well, can talk and walk around and drive a car and write a book and talk and so on. Now, that individual will certainly say things like, oh yes, I remember walking into that machine. And will certainly say things like, I felt a little bit nervous beforehand, but I'm fine now, no problems. But now if you're there also, so is your duplicate. Which one is you and why? Because after all, it looks like both can form memory links to the self that walked in to the machine earlier in the day. And the psychological continuity theory would seem that both count as you. Again, that's a restatement of the puzzle that we had before. But now let me put a little bit more pressure on the theory. If you are a true proponent of the psychological continuity theory, it sure seems like you should be willing to do the following. Step into the machine knowing that after the perfect duplicate has been made, the body that steps into the machine will be destroyed, will be incinerated, for example. Now the result will be there will be a body produced after the incineration occurs. There will also be a pile of ashes that results from the incineration. The new body that walks around will, suppose your name is George, will call himself George and say, oh, I remember walking into that machine. I was a little bit scared, but I'm okay now. And George goes off and does the things that George normally does, or the person named George, rather, goes off and does the things that George normally does. Suppose he's married, suppose he has children, and no one knows what has happened. Then George's spouse, George's children might think, oh, here's Dad or my husband or whatever. Again, no problem. But think about whether you would be willing to go into that incinerator machine. Again, the story is your cells will be the basis of a blueprint, which will then be used to construct a 3D perfect copy of you and your body. The body that steps into that machine or slides into that machine will be incinerated. And then the thing that is produced as a result of the process, two things actually. One, a pile of ashes. Two, a person who's walking around saying, yes, I'm George, who remembers being the self, or seems to remember being the self that was the one that walked into the machine. The question, though, is would you be willing to go into that machine? Would you be willing to go into that machine and become incinerated on the understanding that a perfect duplicate of your body will be produced as a result? If you are shaky about it, feel a little bit of trepidation about it, it might be because you're afraid of the high intensity heat that will result from being incinerated. Don't worry, the machine will produce a gas that will cause you to be knocked unconscious before it incinerates your body. So that's something you should set aside. You won't feel any pain. The question is, will you wake up after the incineration, or will someone else? My experience is that most people who confront this thought experiment will say, no, I will be caused to die. There won't be any me, furthermore, that will survive that event. There will be someone else who is a duplicate of me, who is perfect, who may be able to fool everybody, but who's really an imposter. I'm dead. There's no self named George left, or whatever your name might happen to be. No such person left. It might just be nevertheless that the whole world is fooled into thinking that there is. So what I want you to do is you assess, and notice that this is a form of self-examination. When you assess the adequacy of John Locke's theory of personal identity over time, one way to do so is to ask yourself, would you go into the body duplicator? Because if you are a devout Lockean, so to speak, you should not have any problems doing so. The result will be someone who certainly seems to have genuine memories of the self that occurred before, and it's not clear why Locke would have any problems with saying that it has not just apparent but genuine memories. But if so, if you're at all scared about doing so, then that suggests that you don't actually believe the Lockean theory. You accept something else. So I want you to think about what you'd be comfortable with doing if you would go into that machine. You're on the side of Locke's position on personal identity. If you're not, then that suggests that you don't actually accept his position deep down. We'll need to think about another alternative. What other alternatives might there be for an account of diachronic identity besides the one concerning psychological links, memory links, so to speak? Well, let's recall back to the ship of Theseus example that we gave recently, in which the ship is produced in a certain year and goes out to sea and comes back and goes out to sea and comes back and goes out to sea and comes back, and every time a couple of planks are replaced because they've rotten or become barnacle encrusted, and we can't seem to find a way to take the barnacles off. So the result after 100 years might be a ship that has no matter in common with the ship that left port a century ago. Most people, I think, would be happy to say, still, this is the same ship as the one that left port 100 years ago. As long as we have gradual, piecemeal, bit-by-bit replacement of the parts, it's okay to say, it seems plausible to say, that it's the same ship, just as most people would say a plant might survive even if no single cell that is in the, now suppose it's now a tree, no single cell that was there when it was a sapling. And likewise, many of us would accept the idea that there can be a body that survives, even if a human body that survives, even if every cell in the adult is distinct from any cell that was there at the infant, at the stage of the infant. So too, what's now known as the bodily continuity theory is going to say, well, personal identity over time is a matter of having the same body over that same period of time. Psychological links, memory links, etc., are not important. They're at best a clue to whether or not you're the same person, but they don't constitute you being the same person. What makes you the same person is having the same body. And keeping in mind what we just saw about the ship of Theseus, this idea of the same body leaves open the possibility that the body could change, that you grow a mustache or have your hair cut or have your hair dyed, that you get a nose job, that you get a tattoo, that you get in an accident and lose a limb and get a prosthetic replacement, for example. All those changes are consistent with your having the same body. So long as no change is so drastic that we're in doubt as to whether or not there's the same body as was there before, then we can count as having the same body over time. Roughly speaking, performs the same function, roughly speaking, has largely the same cells from moment to moment, even if over time that continuity the cell level continuity is minimal. So we say P2, person stage P2, is one and the same person as person stage P1, just in case P1 and P2 have the same body. Now, we could also refine this if we wanted to something like having the same central nervous system on the supposition that that somehow is more important to your being the person that you are than than other parts of your body, such as your limbs. That's a possibility. Also, this bodily continuity theory allows considerable change in the matter of which you're composed, just the way the Theseus' ship allows for considerable change, as we saw a moment ago. It also implies that when your body is destroyed in one fell swoop, as happens with the body duplicator machine, so are you. So the bodily continuity theory would allow one to say, yes, the incineration of my body in the example that was just given would be too extreme to count as my being able to survive it. I wouldn't be able to survive that because it would be like taking all of the planks of Theseus' ship, making a perfect duplicate, and then a moment later incinerating all those planks and then building a ship that's perfect, that's exactly the specifications according to the blueprint of the ship that was there before. Most of us would say, we've got a very good replica of the ship of Theseus, but this is not the ship of Theseus. So too, we might say the body duplicator gives you a very good replica of your body, but it's still not your body, and therefore, on the bodily continuity theory, it's still not you. But notice also that on the bodily continuity theory, we've got a significant consequence. That is going to be that on the destruction of your body, such as what happens when you die at age 97, or happens in a terrible car accident, and the physicians are not able to resuscitate you, then you, the self that is you, cannot survive that destruction because there's no bodily continuity. And if that's right, then the ideas of heaven and hell, disembodied existence, are going to have to go by the wayside. If we accept the bodily continuity theory, then unless there's a very different conception of hell and heaven from the one that at least the Western traditions think of, then the idea of surviving the destruction of your body, still being a self in heaven or hell, is not going to make very much sense. Here's a little diagram then of theories of diachronic identity in order to give you a set of choices to think about as you engage in self-examination, to think about what theory seems to you to be the most plausible. On one side we have psychological theories, the best known of which is the Locke-inspired theory concerning memory links. You might also wonder whether there could be a theory that has to do with continuity of personality, whether having a certain type of personality is going to be enough to enable you to be the same person over time. You might also wonder about that, whether that can be made plausible. For example, two people might have pretty much identical personalities, but without counting as the same person. But you might see whether it's possible to develop and refine a theory of psychological continuity in terms of personality. And another alternative is something like what we might call the sameness of soul theory, according to which it's not so much a matter of psychological states, even if you are bereft of psychological states, thoughts, ideas, emotions, etc. Maybe you could still have the same soul that persists through time. And if one held that idea, that would be enough to justify you in saying it's the sameness of soul that gives you diachronic identity over time. Notice, though, that that's a bit of a black box in the sense that it's not clear what will count as saying of a certain individual that it has a soul or some other individual that it does not. And it's not clear what would count as how we could go about justifying claims about one soul as opposed to another. This is a little bit mysterious, perhaps a little bit unsatisfying. And then finally, we've got the bodily continuity theory, which says, as we've just seen, being the same person over time is a matter of bodily continuity, which permits the possibility of changes in the body, but does not allow the changes to be so drastic of the sort that we find with the body duplicator machine. So as you think about what makes you the same person over time as was sitting in the chair where you're sitting now perhaps a week ago, or riding on a bus, driving in a car, going for a walk in the park, I take it you think there is a same self over time that constitutes you. What is the thing that makes it the case? If there is an answer to that question, which of these different, so to speak, menu options would you choose? Now notice also that non-Western traditions are not all going to be happy with the idea that we can really believe in the sameness of person over time. That is, not all traditions, philosophical traditions, assume that or accept that personal identity over time is something we should actually accept. On one strand of Buddhism, we find the denial of that idea. According to certain strands of Buddhism, for example, we can make a distinction between what you might call conventional on the one hand and ultimate truth on the other. Where according to the theory of conventional truth, it's convenient. It's a kind of convenient fiction to talk about the sameness of a person over time. This is the person that wrote that check. This is the person that did that crime. This is the person that owns that car, etc. So those are conveniences that help us organize society. But at the level of what you might call ultimate truth, the idea of a same person over time is going to be something we need to give up on a Buddhist conception, certain types of Buddhist ways of thinking about the self. And this, according to this idea, there's just a swarm of matter here sitting in this chair. And in that swarm of matter, you find some sounds and you find some visual experiences, you find some ways of speaking, you find some ways of behaving, but there's not a self there any more than there's a self that is constituted by the upper part of your pencil and the back of the seat in which you might be sitting right now. There's not a self there. The question is whether it's useful to group things together. It might be useful and convenient to group together the things that constitute this rough swarm of flesh over here sitting in this chair, but that's not a self in anything like the traditional Western sense. And the idea is going to be that we should give up on the idea of a self, that the idea of talking about a self is, strictly speaking, going to be a fiction. What we have is just cells doing various things that are more or less grouped into swarms, and there's more fluidity and less distinction among so-called persons than you might have thought. And it can make sense to talk about I just as a convenience, but it doesn't make any literal sense to talk about I at the fundamental level. Some philosophers have thought that if we give up the idea of a self as persisting through time, as construed in the Western sense, we'll be more open to connection with others, less worried about egocentric concerns, less focused on what matters for me and my own integrity, my own interests, my own personality, and just thinking about all of us, the gigantic swarm that is humanity and perhaps other non-human animals, and think about how to perhaps make things better in the course of that. Not everybody feels that they can make perfect sense of this Buddhist alternative to Western ways of thinking about the self, but I also want to present that to you as an alternative, as an option, as you think about what conception of the self seems most reasonable to you. We mentioned earlier that you can distinguish between diachronic and synchronic questions, and the diachronic question of personal identity concerns the persistence of a self over time, whereas the synchronic question of personal identity concerns what is it for a thing at a time to be a person. What is it for a thing at a time to be a person? And before we try to answer that question, notice that being a person, at least according to mainstream ways of thinking in the Western traditions, is going to imply, for example, that if you're a person, then you possess certain rights. Not to be deprived of your life, not to be deprived of your freedom, for example. Being a person brings with it certain powers, such as, allegedly, the power to not be abused in a certain way. If you're a person, many would say, it would seem that you've got a right not to be treated as a mere means. Kant would certainly say that. If you're a person, then it would be morally improper for someone to treat you as a mere means as opposed to a means. Likewise, if you're a person, it would seem to be possible that you could be blameworthy or responsible for the things that you cause. That is to say, a person seems like it's not just got rights, but also with those rights come some burdens. You can be blameworthy, you can be morally responsible for things that you do if you're a person, in a way that, for example, if a puppy is not a person, we're trying to modify its behavior, but we don't blame or hold responsible a puppy for when it has such things as when it has an accident inside the house. We try to modify its behavior, but we don't hold it blameworthy. We don't, for example, resent it for the things that it does, whereas you might do precisely that for someone we take to be a person. And likewise, a person seems to merit both moral protection and moral assessment. Being a person, as I say, has both its positive side and its burdens. It's possible to count as worthy of protection if you're a person, but also moral assessment. That is, we can blame you for doing something improper. We can accuse you of some kind of wrongdoing. So this has implications for our questions such as if we think that a machine or other primates than our own species, or a newly discovered alien life form, or a fetus, if we think any of these are persons, that's going to have not just practical but also moral consequences for how we treat those individuals. For example, if we think that a fetus is a person, that would seem to imply that therefore the fetus has a right not to have its life deprived of it. Likewise, if we think that a machine could be a person, then if we were to come across such a machine, then it would seem that that machine would, in spite of the fact that it's not made out of flesh, seem to have rights to be treated in a certain way. Take an example from recent archaeology. It's been discovered, I'd say about 5 years ago at this point, that on the Indonesian island of Flores in the Indonesian archipelago, there's evidence that there was a very small hominid, Homo floresiensis, who seemed to have lived between 90 and 130,000, let me try it again, 90 and 13,000 years ago. It's on the Indonesian island of Flores, also one of the few islands that still has Komodo dragons. These individuals, the Homo floresiensis, was about a yard tall, and there's archaeological evidence that they used stone tools and that they were able to take down animals in hunting that were much bigger than themselves, which suggests that they could cooperate, suggests that they were capable of complex, sophisticated, cooperative, concerted efforts, such as is required to take down an animal that's much larger than yourself and perhaps very dangerous. And so suppose that instead of, this is a fairly remote island where these remains were found, suppose that instead of finding remains, we came across a living group of people that had been undiscovered before, all about 3 feet tall, all able to survive for themselves perfectly fine. They had, let's suppose they've got language, they seem to communicate quite effectively, they seem to be able to hunt effectively, take down animals bigger than themselves, they seem to have culture in the sense that they learn things and pass that new knowledge down to their offspring. These would seem to have a pretty good case for being persons in the moral sense that I was just sketching, in spite of the fact they've got very different body types from the ones that we're used to. Many people might say it would therefore be wrong, even if we had the power to do so, to put these individuals on display in, for example, a zoo. It would be questionable ethically to do so because they count as persons even if they don't look like us. Well, then the question is, what is it to count as a person in the sense of synchronic identity? Here are some possible answers. One, according to that's consistent with the same soul theory of diachronic identity, you might say it's a matter of having a soul. Again, the same problems arise as before. How do we go about answering the question whether an individual has a soul, except for by stipulation, which does not seem very satisfactory? Somebody might say, no, being a person is a matter of having some degree of self-consciousness, some degree of self-awareness, some understanding of yourself as a self. And that is something that Locke remarks on. Locke seems to suggest that idea. And that suggests that higher cognitive skills are what is required to count as having a person. Again, there's no reference in this theory to being made out of a particular type of physical stuff, so that there might be no reason why a machine couldn't count as having self-consciousness and therefore be a person. There's no reason why, in principle, a non-human animal couldn't have self-consciousness and therefore count as a person as well. A third kind of theory might say something like this, that being a person is a matter of having a certain kind of biological nature, such as being a member of the species Homo sapiens. Now, that seems plausible enough to those of us who are members of that same species, but you might wonder, first of all, is it possible to be a member of our biological species without being a person, perhaps because you've lost all cognitive function? If somebody who's born a person ends up in a terrible accident, ends up being in what's known as a vegetative state, some of us might feel that they're not a person anymore, even if they're still a human being. That is, the categories of human being as a biological concept and that of a person as a moral, legal concept might come apart. If that happens, then being a member of our species is not sufficient for being a person. Likewise, it would seem being a member of our species might not be necessary for being a person if you think that a sufficiently sophisticated member of Homo floresiensis or a sufficiently sophisticated machine could count as having the higher cognitive skills that you might look for in personhood, then that's going to suggest that being a member of our species is only a rough approximation to what it is to be a person, but by no means necessary or sufficient Now, I should also mention that the Homo sapiens theory is going to be one that corresponds, but not being identical to and not implied by the bodily continuity theory. Those two tend to go hand in hand. You might say, well, being a person is a matter of being a member of a Homo sapiens, and now list all the other types of body types an individual could have to count as being a person. The question then is, how can you specify which body types are necessary and sufficient without giving something that seems arbitrary? And then finally, somebody might say, I give up. Maybe we should go with the Buddhist way, or something that Hume suggested at one point, that maybe being a person at a time is just a matter of stipulation. We as a society just decide where to draw the boundary, where the category of persons ends and the category of non-persons begins, and it's just a matter of stipulation. There's no objective truth that we're discerning. It's kind of like when a couple of people are playing a pickup game of soccer on an open field. They'll just stipulate where the goals are, where the out of bounds are. So too, maybe we as a society can do no better than to stipulate what counts as a person and what does not count as a person. But that seems somehow unsatisfying, if only because when we're trying to decide what to do in cases of potential abortion, when we're trying to decide end-of-life types of questions, when we're trying to decide how should we interact with the machines that are likely to be more and more sophisticated in our future, or how should we respond to the possibility of an encounter with what seems like an intelligent alien life form, it would seem like we would like to do better than just stipulate a yes or no answer, but rather to have reasons. If we're going to look for reasons, then we might be thrown back on one of the earlier theories, either 1, 2, or 3, particularly thinking about 2 and 3 seem like they might be the best candidates for a satisfying theory of diachronic identity. And as we prepare to take on the last major topic for this course, that of freedom of will, I want to shift discussion to something that overlaps with the topic of freedom of will, as we'll be starting next week. And that brings up the issue, is the relationship between personhood and freedom? We can ask that question by asking ourselves, does it make sense to ask, who or what kind of person would I like to be? That is, many creatures make choices without being able to reflect on or modify the desires that drive those choices. A non-human animal, such as a dog, a mouse, a squirrel, or a bird, makes plenty of choices, it seems, but they don't seem to be able to ask themselves, do I want to be the kind of individual that acts on desires and interests such as these? It's not clear that a dog could ask itself, could I possibly be less bothered by the sight of a squirrel running across the yard in the home where I live? You can imagine a dog saying that, but that would only be mythological. It doesn't seem like a dog has the capacity to try to contemplate the possibility of modifying its own will. Other creatures, however, can reflect on themselves and take measures to modify their own desires. For example, somebody might resolve to be less impressed with status or privilege. Somebody might choose to become a person who procrastinates less or socializes outside their well-known, well-established circle that they've stayed inside from high school, for example. And you can imagine a long list of other ways in which you might try to modify the kind of characteristic behavior patterns that apply to you. You might say, there are some characteristic behavior patterns that apply to me, not all of which I'm crazy about. One person might say, I wish I were better organized. Another person might say, I'm too organized. I'm unduly organized. I wish I could chill out a little bit and be less so in order to be a little bit more likely to roll with changes and less tight-fisted about the things that are mine. Insofar as one can go about making changes in oneself in response to these desires, one is thereby, as philosophers like to call it, modifying one's will. That is, you're modifying one's will in the following sense. If your will is defined as that set of desires, inclinations, predilections, habits, character traits that tend to make you behave in the typical ways that you do, the disorganized person tends to lose things. The uber and hyper-organized person never loses things and tends to spend a lot of time making sure all the things that he or she has are where they're supposed to be and all the pencils are sharp and erasers are in good order and so on. The person who's shy tends to avoid encounters, especially with people that they've never met before. A person who is short-tempered tends, of course, to lose their temper and be impolite and conditions of minimal provocation, etc. These are all aspects of a person's will. And One might ask, is it possible to modify one's will? Could I observe my will, think about my will, and do something to modify it, shape it, sculpt it, as it were, into something I'd prefer that it could be? I think most of us would say that seems like a plausible thing to do, even if it's difficult. It still seems possible, especially those at a younger age as opposed to an older. We might get ossified as the years pass and find it more difficult to change our will. But if you're younger, that still is often something that's within your reach. Modifying your will might be a way of exercising freedom as well. So my suggestion is this. We can, as it were, modify or elaborate the self-consciousness theory of synchronic identity. Remember, the self-consciousness theory is the one according to which you're able to consider yourself as a self. And you might elaborate that by saying being a person is also a matter of being able to exercise freedom to modify your will. Of course, doing so requires being able to be to some extent conscious of yourself as a self. You've got to be able to have a theory of your own mind and say, is this the kind of mind, character, etc., that I want to have? And so, according to one theory about synchronic identity, being a person just is a matter of being able to modify your will, that is, to be able to create the kind of will that you would like to have, so that you're not totally in thrall, completely controlled by the will that you were perhaps given, habituated into, raised to have, etc., but rather is something that you could modify, even if doing so is painstaking, takes a long time, a lot of effort, but as long as it's doable, that is perhaps what counts. So on this approach, being a person, if being a person is connected with the capacity to modify one's own will, then being a person is an achievement. It's something that you can struggle to have because you're struggling to make an effort to modify your own will. And it's something that you can also lose the status of. That is to say, you can start life being a person, but if somehow you lose the capacity to modify your will because you're so entrenched in your habits, you're so dug in to your way of living, that you're no longer able to make changes in that aspect of yourself, then you might lose the status of a person, strictly speaking. So the idea is freedom of will. One sense of the term freedom of will might refer to the idea of modifying, exercising the capacity to modify your own will in order to be the kind of person you would like to be. So Shakespeare once said, "As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport." Flies to wanton boys. Where wanton means something like a creature that just follows its desires, follows its instincts, follows its impulses, does not spend any time to reflect on its own desires and instincts and impulses, just behaves accordingly and does what it's going to do, as boys might do to flies. Or what I did when I was young, about 5 years old, my brother and I decided that we had these toys, little toy cars called Hot Wheels, and we decided that not all of our Hot Wheels in our collection were created equal. Both my brother and I got out a hammer and smashed the ones that we thought were not as good as the other ones. And I remember my father looking down at us after we had smashed about half of our Hot Wheels collection in total horror and disgust. And later he said that was a wanton thing to do. It took me about 20 years to figure out what he meant by that, and I think that what he meant was something like this. It was a behavior in which we just acted on impulse. Didn't ask ourselves whether it was right, didn't ask ourselves whether it was proper, didn't ask ourselves whether these other objects might have been better even if we didn't want them, whether it might have been better to give them to other kids that were less fortunate than us, for example. I suspect that I agree at this point that our behavior was wanton, and as such, at that time, I had not, according to this theory of personhood, had not achieved the status of a person. In order to achieve the status of a person, according to this theory, I've got to be able to modify my will. At the time, I didn't seem to have the capacity for that. Maybe it took until I was 10 or 15 before I would have had that capacity. Before, and I might have still had rights to be treated properly and so forth, but that would have been because I was a person in the making, but not a person yet. According to this theory that connects personhood with freedom to modify one's will, then a baby is going to be not yet a person, but likely to be a person, and that's why we still want to protect it. Don't want to use the baby for food or harvesting organs, because doing so would deprive this individual, this biological entity now, the chance of ever becoming a person in the future. So then, being a person in the synchronic sense, according to this theory, is a matter of being able to exercise your freedom of will, and by that I mean freedom to have the will that you choose to have. And again, that's a significant achievement. It's not something that comes easily or naturally. It's not part of your biological endowment just by virtue of being born. It's something that's hard to do, and it's something that can be lost if you don't exercise it at all. So if you don't spend any time in your 80 years of life to reflect on the sort of will that you've got and make any effort whatever to modify it, you might be entirely wanton by the time you're 80, in the sense that you've got your desires, you've got your predilections, you've got your preferences and your dislikes, and you just act on them without responding to any questions about whether these are good or bad things to act on, insofar as you don't engage in the self-examination that Socrates seems to endorse. You could also thereby lose the capacity for personhood because you've lost the capacity to exercise your freedom of will in this broad, robust, and inclusive sense of the term.